much, Ron, for joining us today for this interview and, of course, to know a little bit more about you. So as you know, this year is the centenary of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923. And what we want to do this year is to raise more awareness of this particular act, as well as to, bring to light more of the stories, that some of the families have experienced for your family as well. And I know that you mentioned to me, when we first met, that your family also has a connection to the Chinese Immigration Act. And so I wanted to bring this opportunity today just to talk a little bit more about your family's experience and your thoughts and your reflections on that as well.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Now, when we talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was implemented in 1923, we should not think of that as something that was in isolation. And really, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923 is actually the culmination of the Chinese head tax, which was instituted in around 1885. And the Chinese head tax that was instituted in 1885 was for the sole purpose of limiting Chinese immigration into Canada by taxing them. And it began with a $50 head tax, and when that wasn't enough, they raised it to $100, and by 1905, the head tax was $500, and the main purpose was to be a deterrent for Chinese to immigrate into Canada. And with the Chinese head tax, all it is was to give the Chinese immigrants permission to work in Canada, but with no rights of citizenship. Head tax was levied right up until 1923. And when they abolished the head tax in 1923, they replaced it with the Chinese Exclusion Act, because this was the most effective way to exclude all Chinese from Canada. And there was about, prior to 1923, there were 40,000 Chinese that immigrated to work in Canada, even though they had to pay the $500 head tax. But after the implementation of the Chinese head tax in 1923, which was in force from 1923 to 1945. From 40,000 Chinese immigrants from 1923 to 1945, there were 50 Chinese that were allowed to come into Canada that qualified. That is what exclusion really means, right? And why was it implemented? It was implemented by the mainstream population, and it started in Victoria, and it spread across Canada, and it was implemented because the white population said the Chinese immigrants were taking away their jobs. And when the head tax was first proposed by the people in Victoria, they petitioned the federal government to implement to abolish the Chinese from coming into Canada, and the federal government says no, it's beyond the law at first, right? And then they said, but why not? And then basically the federal government said, we need the Chinese workers to build the railroad, and if we don't allow the Chinese workers in, you can't have the railroad. So that ended the discussion. But after the railroad was completed, the Sir John A. Macdonald started to listen to the people and said, okay, we can we can start implementing a head tax. And that was the beginning of the taxing of the Chinese. However, okay, the popularity grew. Oh, and this is an interesting fact. You know, the Chinese head tax in Newfoundland, they still levied the Chinese head tax of $300 right up until 1945. And then when Newfoundland joined Confederation as the province, then they abolished the head tax. So one of the things I find interesting is how the government and the people of that time kind of minimize what happened, right? It's only now that we have the 100th anniversary, we have the government saying, well, we apologize. But they may apologize, but they do not take responsibility for what they did for a piece of legislation which was immoral, but legally justified by their legalese. So I just wanted to give you a little background of the head tax. The Exclusion Act was just the logical conclusion of trying to exclude Chinese altogether. And all the Chinese that were documented with the head tax starting in 1885, there were large ledgers where each Chinese individual was documented, and there would be 19 columns of information such as where they came from in China, what boat they came over, what occupation they were having, where they were living, and this is so they could keep track of the Chinese wherever they were in Canada. And with the head tax certificate, the Chinese had to show it as identification that they had permission to stay. And then when we had the Exclusion Act, where the government published, right? This it was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's 15 pages long, and it just details all the different rules and regulations excluding Chinese, and they added rules for the Chinese that were already here, had 1 year to register themselves or suffer a $1,000 fine or 12 months in jail or both. And there were huge posters in every town and in every province in English and Chinese telling the Chinese that were already here to register. And the Chinese parents had 1 year to register their children. And that's why when you look at these were called certificates numbers, and there were different types. There was a CI 44 certificate, the CI 45 certificate for different classes of Chinese immigrants. So the Exclusion Act was based upon I'd say greed, anger, and ignorance by the mainstream population. Greed, because they wanted to exclude Chinese people from any employment. And one of the reasons they kept saying was, they're taking our jobs away. But what happened? The employers, the CPR, their policy was to pay the Chinese workers half the salary of a white person. Moreover, when the Chinese worker came, they got half the salary of a white person, but they also had to furnish. They had to pay for their own food, clothing, and accommodation. So the economic problem of Chinese workers being cheap labor was fostered by the government. And yet they played the populist playbook and catered to the people that elected them. And you have to remember, the Chinese had no Canadian citizenship rights. They had no right to vote. They had no legal rights. So how does one fight a system where you have no legal rights? And when they did implement the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were demonstrations in Chinatowns across Canada, and they called it the Day of Humiliation. And it's documented. You can go back to the newspapers, and they have pictures of this, and they have documented stories of this. But why isn't this presented in the public, right? When we had this 100th anniversary, they had in the Canadian Senate, they had a presentation where they officially recognized the Chinese Exclusion Act as being a part of a historical fact.